The last time I saw my wife and daughter was at the edge of the marina, early morning calm water, not a cloud in the sky. Hannah had just tossed the last tackle box into the boat and Sophie was tugging at her life vest, grinning. I remember she asked if I could come with them and I told her I had to help a friend fix his outboard motor. She pouted like 9-year-olds do, then waved like crazy as they pulled away. I watched them disappear into the horizon, just a speck against the blue. I had no idea that would be the last time I'd see them. My name's Eli Wells. I'm from Greyhour, a small maritime town on the Oregon coast, the kind of place where you measure time by tides and fishing seasons. I'm a maintenance tech by trade, fix boats, weld frames, patch nets. Nothing glamorous, but it keeps a roof over your head and food on the table. We weren't rich, but we had what we needed. Hannah taught elementary school. Sophie had just turned 9. She loved fishing more than most boys her age, and I'd just given her her first real rod, a bright red Mariner Pro with a chrome reel and her initials etched into the grip. She named it Crabby. That morning I stood on the dock watching them leave like I always did. The plan was simple, a few hours of fishing off the point back before the afternoon breeze kicked up. The forecast called for light rain, nothing serious. I told Hannah to be back before it hit. She laughed and said she'd bring dinner, but the weather changed faster than anyone expected. By noon, the clouds rolled in heavy dark, unnatural. By 2, the winds were up and the sea was thrashing. A freak front pushed through something fierce. Storm warnings blared on every station. I called her phone. No answer. Then again, and again. I don't remember driving back to the marina, but I do remember standing there soaked to the bone watching the surf tear into the dock. And I remember the Coast Guard boat pulling in late that night empty. They searched for 3 days helicopters, sonar volunteers. They found part of the hull floating 15 miles south, then Hannah's waterproof backpack, and Sophie's little blue fishing hat, the one with the cartoon trout sewn on the front. Her name was still written inside in black Sharpie. Everyone said the same thing. It was the storm. Sudden, brutal. They probably never had a chance. But I couldn't make peace with that. Something in me refused to believe they were gone. Maybe it was the way Sophie's rod hadn't turned up, or how I kept dreaming about them on dry land calling my name. I started going out every weekend, different areas, deeper dives, always hoping I'd find something, anything. 8 months passed. I still visited the marina every Saturday morning before heading out. Same dock, same time. Most days it was just me and the gulls. Sometimes I'd bring flowers and toss them into the water. Other times I'd just stand there and stare out across the bay. But that morning, something changed. I was loading my tanks when my phone rang. Unknown number, local prefix. I answered. Mr. Wells, this is Officer Reynolds from Greyhour Police. We need you to come in right away. My stomach dropped. There's been a development in your family's case. That was all he said, but I felt it in my bones. Something was about to shift, and whatever came next, it wasn't going to make sense. Not yet. Not in the way people expect. The officer didn't say much more over the phone, just that I needed to come in right away. I drove straight to the station, trying not to let my mind spiral. I'd learned by then not to get pulled in by false hope. There had been a few tips early on. Someone thought they saw Hannah at a gas station 2 towns over. Another claimed a boat matching theirs was spotted near Devil's Cove. None of them went anywhere. Still, something about the officer's voice this time felt different. Steady but not dismissive. Like he already knew this wasn't just another dead end. When I pulled up, Officer Reynolds was already waiting outside. He opened the door before I even got out of the truck. "Thanks for coming, Mr. Wells," he said, and I could tell he was measuring his words carefully. "There's someone you need to speak with." He led me into a small conference room. Inside was another officer and a man I didn't recognize at first. Mid-50s, deeply tanned skin, calloused hands. I'd probably passed him on the docks a dozen times, but never knew his name. "This is Tomas Herrera," Reynolds said. "He came in this morning with a report we think you need to hear." The man nodded and extended a hand. "Wish we were meeting under better circumstances, sir." I shook it. "What did you see?" He glanced at the officers, then back at me. "I run deliveries to the Marine Research Station on Wolf Island every few days, preserved seafood equipment parts. Today, I took the early run. On my way back, I cut through the old shipping lane near the Wolf Rock Lighthouse. Saves me about 40 minutes when the tide's right. I knew the spot. A narrow pass between two rocky shoals, not somewhere you'd take a leisure cruise, but the working boats used it all the time. It was foggy this morning. Tomas' continued visibility was low, but as I came past the lighthouse, I saw someone on the dock. He hesitated. A little girl, standing out near the railing. She was waving. My chest tightened. How old? Hard to say. Maybe 8 or 9. I didn't get close, and with the fog. But something about her felt familiar. I didn't think much of it until I got back to the harbor and saw one of the missing person flyers, the one with your daughter's picture. Then it hit me. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Herrera wasn't entirely certain, which is why he came to us before contacting you directly. We've had other sightings before, but—" "The lighthouse," I said. "It's abandoned, isn't it?" "Technically decommissioned," Reynolds replied. "It was sold 20-some years ago to a private citizen, Malcolm Vire. Keeps it up for historical purposes, far as we know. Doesn't live there full-time. I asked if they had a number for him." Reynolds pulled out a folder. "We tried it. Disconnected." I didn't hesitate. "We need to go out there." Reynolds looked unsure. "Mr. Wells, we don't have a warrant or probable cause." Thomas interrupted. "The weather's clear today. I'll take you myself. My boat's tied up at the dock." Reynolds exchanged a look with the other officer, then nodded. "I'll make the call for a patrol boat. If there's a child out there, we can't wait." Less than an hour later, we were on the water, me, Tomas, and 2 officers. The ocean was calm, unusually calm. Just long swells and soft chop against the hull. No wind. The kind of stillness that makes you nervous without knowing why. As we approached Wolf Rock, the lighthouse came into view. Towering. Gray. Standing on its own little slice of stone. The dock below it was weathered maybe 20 feet long, barely above the tide line. That's when I saw it. A small wooden boat, half splintered and clearly wrecked, was pulled up against the rocks. "That wasn't there last week," Thomas said under his breath. Officer Carter guided the patrol boat in and secured us to the dock. We stepped out slowly. Police Carter called out, knocking on the heavy metal door. "Anyone inside?" No answer. "This is where she was standing," Thomas said, pointing toward the far end of the dock. "Right here." After a few more knocks, with no response, Carter tried the door. Locked. "Could have been a trick of the fog," one of the officers muttered, but Thomas shook his head. "I know what I saw." We were about to decide our next move when we heard another motor. A boat was approaching from the mainland, modern, faster than anything out here. At the helm was an older man with white hair, lean frame, and a guarded look on his face. He cut the engine as he neared and stepped onto the dock without hesitation. "Can I help you, gentlemen, Coastal Police?" Carter said, showing his badge. "Are you Malcolm Vire?" "I am." "This is my property." "What's this about?" "We received a report of a child seen at this location earlier today. We're here to follow up." Vire's expression didn't change much. "That must have been my niece. I was here this morning collecting a few things from storage." He said it like it was nothing. Carter asked to see a photo. Vire hesitated, then pulled out his phone. He scrolled, turned it toward us for barely a second, then tucked it away. The girl had short blonde hair and a red jacket. Tomas looked uncertain. "That Could be who I saw. Maybe. It was foggy. I was far out. I couldn't stay quiet. Are you sure? I asked him. You said it looked like Sophie. You said it felt familiar. It did, he said quietly. It did. Carter turned back to Vire. Since we're here, would you mind if we had a look inside? I'd prefer you didn't. There's nothing here but old gear and dust. Still, it would help clear this up. Vire stared at us for a long second, then sighed and pulled a set of keys from his pocket. Fine, but don't touch anything. Inside the lighthouse smelled of salt and mildew. The main level was sparsely furnished, folding table chair and old cot against the wall. Dust covered most of it, but the storm cellar had a lock. Carter asked what was down there. Storage, Vire said. Old tools, furniture. He unlocked the door and we followed him down. A single bulb flickered above, casting long shadows. There were crates, boxes, tarps over things I didn't recognize. But Vire moved in front of a tall cabinet at the far wall like he was trying to block it from view. What's in the cabinet? I asked. Personal items, he said. Family things. I'd rather not. Carter stepped closer. Mind if we look? Yes, he said quickly. They belonged to my late daughter. He was getting more agitated, his hands twitching slightly. That's when I saw it. Through a crack in the cabinet door, just for a second, I saw something pale, something familiar. A cream-colored hat with faded stitching along the edge. Hannah's. I didn't say anything yet. I let Carter finish his walkthrough, but as we turned to leave, I spoke up. Those rods over there, one big one child-sized, that's the same set I bought for my wife and daughter. Same make, same trim. Vire's face hardened. They're mine, and the hat in the cabinet. That's Hannah's. He didn't answer. Just turned, disappeared back into the cellar, and returned with the hat and a toolbox. I found this washed up weeks ago, he said. You can have it. He thrust it toward me like it meant nothing. I took it. My hands shook. It was hers. No question. We left shortly after. Carter asked for a phone number. Vire claimed he didn't have one. When pressed, he gave a vague answer about living on the north shore of Wolf Island, said we could find him there if needed. But as he pushed off from the dock, I watched his boat angle away, heading toward the mainland instead. Tomas stood beside me, silent. After a while, he said, You know what's strange? That girl in his photo, short hair. But when I saw her this morning, she had braids. I stared at the waves. Sophie's always worn her hair in braids. Hannah would never cut it. Tomas nodded. And another thing. He said he lives on Wolf Island, but I've been running deliveries to the research station there for 15 years. I've never seen him. Never heard anyone mention a man and a child living out there. I didn't reply. I just stood there holding Hannah's hat, the stitching worn where her fingers had worked it. The wind picked up, and somewhere in the distance a gull cried. We didn't say much after that. Tomas had another delivery run in the morning. He promised to ask around, see if the researchers on Wolf Island had ever heard of Malcolm Vire. We exchanged numbers and shook hands. I waited until he'd pulled away in his truck before I headed back to mine. I didn't go home. Not right away. Instead, I drove to the waterfront district. The Silver Anchor was still open. If anyone in town knew where a man like Vire docked his boat, it would be the folks there. I needed answers. And I wasn't waiting anymore. Of course. Here's part 3 of your 9-part true crime story written in a continuous, emotionally grounded style for TTS delivery. I went back to the sheriff's office that morning with the printouts, the photos, and the missing person report in hand. Deputy Alvarez was behind the desk, sipping coffee, flipping through something on his phone. I told him Hannah hadn't come home. I told him I had reason to believe she and our daughter had never made it to the cabin. I told him the address was fake, that I'd been there, that I'd seen it with my own eyes. He looked up slowly like he was already deciding how long he was willing to entertain what he assumed was just panic. I asked him to run the license plate, but he said it was too early to file anything official. "You sure you're not just missing a fight?" he asked, like I might be one of those guys whose wife leaves for a few hours and he panics. I told him no. Not Hannah. Not with Sophie. Not like this. But he kept that same soft, patronizing smile, said he'd note the concern and told me to check back if I still hadn't heard anything by the end of the day. By the time I left the station, I knew I couldn't rely on them. I went home, printed every photo I could find of Hannah and Sophie, and drove straight to the local news affiliate. They wouldn't take me on air without law enforcement verification, but one of the interns agreed to share the flyer to their online bulletin board. Said she'd post it to their socials too. That was something. I drove to every gas station on Route 12, handed out flyers to bored clerks and overworked cashiers. Most didn't even look up until I was already out the door. A few said they'd keep an eye out. One man took the paper, folded it in half, and slid it under the counter without a word. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I just moved on. I called Hannah's parents. Left 3 voicemails. Her sister, too. Then I started calling every number in her phone, old co-workers, her hairdresser, even her gym. Everyone said the same thing: they hadn't heard from her. They hadn't seen her. And no, they didn't know about any cabin trip. One of her co-workers said they hadn't seen her at school for over a week. That didn't make sense. She'd told me she was grading essays just 3 nights before. I asked if someone could check her classroom, maybe see if her car was still in the lot. They told me the building was locked for winter break. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I called the sheriff's office again. Alvarez answered. I told him it had been over 24 hours, that I'd confirmed the address was false and that Hannah's workplace couldn't account for her. He said he'd make a note, but it still wasn't a formal investigation. Said it sounded like a domestic matter. That maybe she'd just needed space. I asked him what kind of mother takes her daughter into the woods in December without telling anyone, without bringing clothes or food, without answering her phone, and he said, "I don't know, sir. But people do strange things all the time." Then he hung up. That was the first time I felt something crack. Not just the helplessness, but the realization that I might be the only person in the world who thought this was real. I sat in the hallway for hours, phone in hand, door wide open, waiting for headlights that never came. I kept replaying everything from the last few weeks. Was there anything I'd missed? Any signs? Any words she'd said that meant something else? At 3 a.m, I drove back out to the location she'd texted. I parked by the mailbox again and walked into the woods. This time I brought a flashlight. It was colder than the night before, low 20s wind sharp through the pines. I walked until I found the same clearing. Empty. Just a wide circle of dirt and frost broken by tire tracks and one set of footprints that didn't match mine. They were smaller, lighter, a child's. They led halfway across the clearing and then disappeared. I followed the tire tracks back to the road, counted them. 2 sets coming in, only 1 going out. When I got back to the car, I found a piece of red thread wedged under the windshield wiper. No note, no markings, just the thread. I didn't know what it meant, if it meant anything, but I kept it. Drove it straight home, folded it into a plastic sandwich bag, and put it in the top drawer of my desk. That was the moment I knew someone had been watching me. They'd seen me come back, and they wanted me to know it. I called Rivera the next morning. Left a message with his secretary. I didn't care if it looked desperate. I needed someone to listen, someone to treat this like it was real. I'd already lost faith in the local force. I wasn't going to lose time waiting on them to come around. That afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was Sophie's coat, red, fleece-lined, torn at the sleeve, draped over a chair I didn't recognize. The background was too dark to see anything else. No location tag, no timestamp. Oh, just the image. I tried to trace it. Nothing. When I took it to Alvarez, he said it wasn't proof of a crime, just a picture. No visible child, no blood, no threat. I asked him if he had children. He didn't answer, just said he'd forward it to the Digital Crimes Unit and they'd be in touch if anything came up. I walked out before I said something I couldn't take back. That night I sat at the kitchen table staring at the photo, every light off except the one above the stove. I zoomed in on every inch of it. There was something in the lower corner, blurred out of focus. Maybe a boot. Maybe a leg. I couldn't be sure. But the more I stared at it, the more I felt like I'd seen that carpet before. It was the pattern. Brown and gray with that weird woven texture. I didn't know where, not yet, but I knew it wasn't random. That's when the phone rang. Not the cell, my landline. No caller ID. I picked up. Silence. Then a voice. Low, male, calm. Just 2 words. Stop looking. Then the line went dead. He placed the gun down like it weighed nothing. No urgency, no fear. Then he raised his hands, slow and controlled, and stepped back from the edge of the dock. The spotlight from the chopper held him in that fixed glare as 2 patrol boats pulled in fast, officers already on deck with weapons drawn. I watched from the reeds, still crouched low beside Thomas, the binoculars pressed so tight against my face it was starting to hurt. The moment felt like it had stretched out forever. I kept waiting for him to run, or to reach for something, or to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there while they cuffed him. When they led him toward the boat, he turned his head and looked straight at us, right through the trees. I don't know how he knew where we were, but his eyes locked onto mine like he'd been expecting me all along. There was no shock on his face, no guilt, just this cold awareness like he'd accepted something I hadn't even figured out yet. Then, just before the boat pulled away, he started laughing. It wasn't loud, but I heard it over the water, over the chopper blades, over everything. That laugh didn't fit the moment. It didn't fit anything. It just echoed there between the trees and the shoreline while I tried to make sense of what we'd just seen. When the officers called us out, Tomas eased our boat forward and followed their lead back toward the dock. There were more vessels on scene now, including one marked for emergency medical. I didn't know what to expect when we pulled up. Part of me wanted to run straight into that cabin and rip the place apart with my bare hands. But another part of me, stronger somehow, just stood there. Still. Waiting. A medic came out of the boathouse carrying a small figure wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. She looked smaller than I remembered her face, too pale, her body limp in the medic's arms. But I knew her. Even before I saw her face clearly, I knew her. "That's my daughter," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just said it. An officer stepped in front of me, holding out a hand. "Sir, please let them do their job." The medic was already on the move toward the medical boat. I caught a glimpse of Sophie's hair, chopped short now, and her eyes barely open, dazed, unfocused. But she was breathing. Tomas stood beside me. He whispered, "That's her. That's the girl I saw." I nodded. I couldn't speak. Everything else around us kept moving officers' equipment radios, crackling. But I couldn't hear any of it. Not really. Just the sound of my own breathing and the wind against the dock. A few minutes later, another group of officers came out, this time carrying a body bag. I didn't need to ask. I didn't want them to unzip it. I already knew. It was Hannah. The part of me that had held on to even the smallest hope that maybe she'd survived too. Maybe she'd just been somewhere else in that awful place, collapsed right there on the dock. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. But my knees gave out and I dropped into a crouch like the weight of it all had finally landed. One of the detectives walked over slowly. She crouched beside me. "We'll need a formal ID, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. I just nodded. That was enough. She stood again and motioned to one of the units. They were loading more things out of the boathouse now, 2 large coolers sealed tight. One of the officers nearby was holding a plastic container marked for evidence. A second detective approached, looked at me carefully, and said, "There's more inside. We'll need your statement once we return to the station. But I want to prepare you now. The scene inside is disturbing." Tomas looked over at the coolers. "What's in those?" The officer hesitated. "We believe they contain human remains. Multiple individuals. Catalogued. Preserved." I couldn't process it. Not all at once. The girl who'd been in the blanket, that was Sophie. The woman in the body bag, Hannah. But everything else, I didn't know where to put it in my mind. They let us ride back on a separate patrol boat. Sophie was already en route to Greyhor Memorial. I asked if I could go with her, but they said she needed to be stabilized first, that the medical team would call as soon as she was admitted. They promised I could see her. Just not yet. At the station, they took Tomas and me into separate rooms. I gave them everything I had, every detail from the lighthouse visit to the inlet chase, from the hat in the cabinet, to the fishing rods, to Malcolm's expression when we mentioned Sophie's name. I told them about the conversation at the Silver Anchor, what Doug said about the boathouse, how it didn't add up. When I finished, I asked the detective her name was Rivera. Why? That was all I said. Just why? She didn't answer right away. She closed her notebook, sat back in her chair, and said, "We've started processing the site, and his journals." Then she paused. "Mr. Wells, this goes beyond what we expected." I waited. "He didn't take your wife and daughter because he wanted money, or revenge, or even control in the usual sense. According to his writings, he believed he was preserving something. He called it the maternal bond." I didn't understand. She explained that inside the cabin they'd found photographs posed artificial. Malcolm with women and children who weren't his. All dressed, all positioned, like family portraits. Some of the photos included Hannah and Sophie, staged, forced, silent. The detective went quiet for a moment, then added, he kept everything. Pieces of fabric, strands of hair, some stored in resin blocks, some in jars. I didn't want to ask, but I did. "What about the toolbox?" She nodded slowly. It held surgical instruments, custom made. He labeled each one. "We think he was planning a procedure. He called it preservation." "Your wife." Her voice lowered. "She was killed recently, maybe only hours before we arrived." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could think was that she'd survived the storm, survived 8 months, and we were just hours too late. The rest of what Detective Rivera told me didn't settle right away. That Malcolm had once been a maritime engineer, that his own wife and daughter died in a ferry accident years ago on a vessel he helped design, that he withdrew from public life not long after, bought the lighthouse, built the cabin, the boathouse, the obsession, the routine, one victim after another. All of them mother-daughter pairs, all taken from small towns up and down the coast, all hidden in that same quiet corner of the inlet just a few miles from where we all lived our lives without ever noticing. Rivera said they'd confirmed 3 other families so far. Others were being tested. She said the journals went back at least 10 years, all written in the same neat, measured handwriting. No rage, no panic, just planning. Like he thought he was fixing something broken, or building something that never existed. She said there'd be more questions in the coming days, more interviews, possibly a trial, possibly not. But that right now, the only thing I needed to focus on was my daughter. Then she stood and said, "The hospital just called. Sophie's awake. They're ready for you." And that was it. I followed the officer outside, stepped into the cruiser, and left the station behind. The road back to Greyhor Memorial was quiet. I kept thinking about the dock, the weight of that silver blanket, and the way Hannah's hat had looked in my hands, faded but whole. The wind had picked up by the time we pulled in, rattling the flagpole out front. I stepped out slowly, not ready, but moving anyway. The hallway outside Sophie's room smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear. The nurse walked just ahead of me, explaining her vitals, her breathing, the IV line, the sedatives still working their way out of her system. I nodded, but I didn't really hear most of it. I just wanted to see her. When we reached the room, the nurse paused before opening the door. "She may be confused when she wakes," she said softly. "Let her set the pace." I stepped inside and stopped. Sophie was so small in that bed. Pale. Her head was shaved short like they'd needed to do it quickly. Her arms were thin, even thinner than I remembered from those last weeks before the storm. The blanket was tucked up high, and the monitor beside her beeped in slow, steady rhythm. I sat down next to her and took her hand. Cold but warm enough to hold on. She didn't move. Her eyelids fluttered once. I leaned in and whispered her name. "Sophie." "I'm here, sweetheart. Daddy's here." Nothing at first, then a twitch in her fingers, a small one. Not much, but it was something. I stayed like that for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe more, just holding her hand and watching her breathe. When the nurse returned to adjust something on the monitor, she nodded at me and said, "She knows you're here." I didn't move. Didn't want to do anything that might pull her away from wherever she was drifting. I stayed the whole night. Somewhere around dawn, her eyes opened. Not all the way, not at first. She looked around the room like she wasn't sure it was real. Then she turned her head and saw me. "Daddy." It came out like a breath. I leaned forward. "Yes, baby, I'm here." Her lips trembled. "Where's Mommy?" I swallowed hard. "We'll talk about that soon. Right now, I just want you to rest." But she shook her head, slow, careful. The man said, he said she was too loud. Her voice cracked. I tried not to cry. I reached for her and she let me. Her arms came up slow, shaky, and wrapped around my neck. I felt her chest rise and fall against mine. I didn't speak for a while. I just held her. At some point she whispered, "She told me you'd come." I told her I never stopped looking. Not once. And I meant it. Every word. A few hours later, when she'd fallen back asleep, Dr. Patel came in. He explained what they'd found. Physically, Sophie was stable. Mild respiratory infection, moderate malnutrition. She was underweight, but responsive. With care and rest, she'd recover. But emotionally, it would take time. He mentioned a psychologist, Dr. Morgan, who specialized in trauma recovery for children. I nodded and said yes to everything. I didn't care what it cost. She needed help, and she'd get it. I asked about Hannah's body. He said the medical examiner still had her, but once the autopsy was complete, they'd release her to me. He offered to put me in touch with a social worker to help with arrangements. I said I'd handle it when the time came. I just wanted Sophie to feel safe again. Late that afternoon, while Sophie was resting, I went down to the hospital chapel. Not to pray exactly, just to sit. It was quiet in there. Dim light from the stained glass windows. Worn pews that creaked when you shifted your weight. I sat in the back and thought about the cabinet in the lighthouse, the fishing rods, the hat, the way Malcolm had stepped in front of that door like he was guarding something more than old gear. And then I thought about that girl in the photo he showed us. Short hair, round face, red jacket. It looked enough like Sophie that Tomas wasn't sure. But now, knowing how she actually looked, how her hair had been cut, how small she was, I realized that picture wasn't just a cover. It was preparation. He must have taken it weeks ago, maybe months. He was planning something, a story. a backup, something to say when the wrong person got too close. I thought about the first time I saw Malcolm's face, that calm, almost practiced expression, the way he laughed when they arrested him. None of it made sense until I remembered what Rivera said about the journals, about the labeling, the resin blocks, the way he posed the bodies like family portraits. There was no panic in him because he didn't see any of it as wrong. He saw it as complete. Later that evening, Rivera called. They'd gone back through the cabin and found more. An album, more photos, more items arranged in unnatural ways. A ribbon that might have been Sophie's, a scarf that looked like it belonged to someone else's daughter. She said they were still working through the names and cross-checking missing persons reports from nearby counties. So far, they'd confirmed 3 other mother-daughter pairs. All reported missing within a 100-mile stretch over the last 10 years. No bodies ever recovered. She told me they'd be reaching out to those families next. And then she said something that stuck with me. Mr. Wells, we believe you and Mr. Herrera got there just in time. Based on what we found in the coolers, he had a method, a process. Your wife was prepared the same way, and we believe your daughter was next. I didn't answer. Just stared out the window and listened to the sound of Sophie breathing beside me. That night I stayed by her side again. She was sleeping more steadily, color coming back to her cheeks. But just before midnight, she woke up crying. No words, just a long, quiet sob that filled the room. I held her until she fell asleep again. She never asked to leave the lights on. She just kept one hand on my arm the whole night like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. And I understood, because for a long time I thought she already had. 2 days after Sophie was stabilized, I went back out to the inlet. Not officially, no warrant, no escort, just me and one of the deputies who'd been at the original recovery. His name was Carter. He didn't say much, didn't have to. I'd asked Rivera for access, and she'd cleared it, said the outer perimeter had been secured and cataloging was still underway. But if I needed to see where it all happened, she understood. Carter piloted the boat, and I sat up front, hands folded in my lap. The water was flat that morning, sunlight cutting across it in a long, bright line. I kept watching the channel markers pass by, counting them like it might keep my head still. By the time we reached the bend near the reeds, I could already see the outline of the boathouse and cabin. Nothing had changed. Same sag in the roof line, same torn tarp flapping on the corner beam. The whole place looked like it was waiting for something. We tied off and stepped onto the same dock I'd watched from days earlier. Carter unlocked the door to the boathouse and held it open for me. Inside, the air was cooler stale, but not foul. The evidence teams had cleared most of the major items, coolers, jars, the journal. What remained were outlines. Faint marks on the floor where the storage bins had been plastic sheeting tacked to one wall, a metal folding table near the back with small circles etched into the dust where jars had sat. I walked past it all and stood near the back wall where they'd found Hannah. Carter didn't follow me in. He stayed near the door, respectful. I knelt down, put a hand on the concrete, and stayed there for a while. I don't know what I expected. Some feeling, maybe? Something to rise up. But it was just a cold floor and silence. After a while, I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked back out into the sun. Carter nodded once. He didn't ask me anything. We moved up toward the cabin next. This was where it got harder. Inside it looked like someone had tried to live 2 lives at once. One side of the room was sparse, a bedroll, a small gas burner cans stacked neatly under a shelf. The other side was arranged like a child's bedroom. Not just furniture. Toys, books, a child's desk with drawings taped to the wall. Not originals, photocopies. Pulled from coloring books, the same few images over and over. I picked one up. It was a picture of a girl with a sun hat standing in a garden. There were 6 versions of it on the wall, each colored a little differently, One all in red, one just in green. Another where everything but the eyes had been colored in. Sophie hadn't done those. I asked Carter if anyone had figured out who drew them. He shook his head. I turned toward the table in the far corner. That was where they'd found the resin blocks. Paperweights. At least that's what they looked like. Now it was just empty space. I stepped closer to the small shelf built into the wall behind it. A single label was still tacked there, yellowing and curling at the edges. It said, Preserved 6B. That's all. Just those words. Rivera had said he'd cataloged everything. According to the reports, he'd created an entire system. Rows, categories, item types, preserved cloth, hair, jewelry, small bone fragments. I couldn't bring myself to ask if Sophie's items had been labeled. I didn't want to know. I stepped away from the shelf and turned back toward the doorway. Carter was looking out the window now. "You all right?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Did anyone find a radio?" I asked. "In here. Or at the lighthouse. Not one that worked," he said. "A couple old receivers, nothing with signal. But he told them he'd call for help." Carter didn't answer. I was thinking back to what Sophie had said about the storm, about the moment their boat started to take on water and how a light had appeared near the shoreline, how she'd seen a man waving them toward the dock. She thought it was help. So did Hannah. That was the last moment that made sense to either of them. Everything after that changed. Back at the station, Rivera had told me they'd recovered a second set of journals older than the ones they found at first. These were less organized fragments, sketches, long sections of writing that read more like a personal log than a record. In those, they found entries that went back years, mentions of locations, coastal towns, ferry schedules, details about single mothers. They were building a timeline now, trying to match his movements to unsolved cases. One entry stood out to them. It was dated a month before Hannah and Sophie disappeared. In it, Malcolm described a storm approaching and a mother-daughter pair easy to love. He wrote that the younger one had light in her voice and that the older one was disciplined but kind. Then a line beneath it boxed in, "They'll come to me." Carter and I didn't speak again until we were back in the boat. The ride back was quiet. As we passed the lighthouse, I looked up at the top window, the one that had been fogged when we visited it the first time. The glass had been cleaned now. Forensics, maybe. But seeing it that clear, that blank gave me a feeling I hadn't expected. It didn't feel like an answer. It felt like something unfinished. I asked Carter if they'd found anything else in the lighthouse. He said just an old cabinet, same as before, a few tools, food wrappers, but nothing that gave a clear timeline. "What about the boat?" I asked. "The one washed up by the rocks." "It's been brought in," he said. "Hull's cracked. It's the kind they stopped making about 20 years ago. Registered to a defunct manufacturer in Alaska. No paperwork, no numbers." That matched what Doug had told me about Malcolm buying parts from auctions, assembling old equipment from salvage. He'd built his life out of cast-offs, things no one else had use for. I sat back and let the wind push through my shirt as we neared the harbor. From a distance, the town looked the same. Fishermen hauling gear, gulls circling the docks, everything moving like it always had. You wouldn't know that just a few miles out, someone had built a shrine to control, to grief, to something too broken to name. Carter tied off and helped me out of the boat. I thanked him and started back toward the truck. As I reached the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was Rivera. They'd finished going through more of the materials found in the cabin. One of the last items logged was a tape recorder. Inside it, a single cassette. No label, just a faint smudge on the edge. She said they were preparing to play it later that day. I told her I'd come in. Whatever was on it, whatever he left behind, I needed to hear it. I didn't know if it would answer anything. But I had the feeling it was meant for someone. Maybe Hannah. Maybe Sophie. Or maybe me. Either way, I was ready to listen. The conference room at the sheriff's office was quiet when I got there. One fluorescent light flickered near the corner and someone had drawn the blinds halfway shut, like they weren't sure if this was supposed to feel private or official. Rivera stood by the table, arms crossed, a small recorder in front of her. The cassette was already loaded. She looked at me not with pity, thank God, but like someone who knew we were about to step over a line neither of us could uncross. I sat down and waited. She didn't say anything, just pressed play. At first, there was nothing. A little hiss, a soft hum like wind through wires. Then a man's voice, slow and even. March 5th. Morning fog hasn't lifted. The girl doesn't sleep unless the room is sealed. I think she's starting to understand the pattern. His tone was flat. No edge to it, no rage, no excitement. Just documenting, like he was reading instructions. The mother continues to resist. She will be moved tonight. There was a pause, a rustling sound, maybe paper. The daughter needs routine. She eats better when I sing to her. She colors more when the lights stay low. Rivera kept her eyes on the table. I listened, feeling each word land heavier than the last. The voice continued, sometimes drifting, sometimes sharply specific. He described how he labeled objects, how certain materials preserved better than others, how silence made things last. I've decided to keep the cabinet open. It helps them settle. A click, a pause, then a new section. This time the voice was closer to the mic, more deliberate. To the father, if you're hearing this. I felt my body still. He went on. You should have stayed away. You weren't supposed to be part of this. It was about the quiet, about removing the noise. The girl was almost perfect. But the mother... He stopped. For a full 10 seconds, just breathing. Then a whisper. She screamed so much I had to close her early. My jaw clenched. Rivera reached over and stopped the tape. There's more, she said quietly, but it gets worse. I nodded. Not because I needed to hear it, but because I couldn't not. She pressed play again. The tape clicked forward. The voice returned. Now it was shakier, like it had been recorded at night, maybe after something had happened. I dream of them all. The early ones. They line up outside the cabinet and ask me why I changed the rules. Why I started keeping their voices. He coughed. But Sophie doesn't ask. She watches. Just watches. Then silence again. A long one. At the end of the tape, you could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound of a door creaking. Then a final line, almost a whisper. This one I won't bury. Rivera stopped the player. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, "We think he recorded that 3 nights before you and Thomas got there." I nodded, not sure what to do with that. Not sure it made anything better or worse. She reached for a folder on the table and slid it over to me. These came back from the FBI, she said. Prints lifted from the resin blocks. One matched a woman missing from Brunswick, Georgia, 2012. Another matched a child missing from Pensacola. The rest are still being run. I looked down at the photos. They were blurry old. Family snapshots, beach days, birthday cakes, ordinary things. Rivera said there were at least 9 sets of remains linked to Malcolm now. Some partial, some complete. All arranged in the same manner. Labeled, stored, curated like exhibits. He never kept a single full body in the same place. Some were found in the inlet. Others at a rental unit 2 towns over. Some they may never find. When I got back to the hospital that night, Sophie was awake. She'd drawn something crayons on hospital paper. A picture of a house. I asked if it was ours. She shook her head. "That's where the quiet lives," she said. I asked what she meant. She looked at me for a long time and said, "He said if I was quiet long enough, I could stay." I sat beside her and held her hand. "You're not there anymore," I told her. "You're here. You're safe." She didn't answer, just kept coloring. The next morning, Rivera called again. They'd gone back through the second cabin, another property tied to Malcolm through a fake shell company. It was nearly empty. But behind a false wall, they found a storage unit. Inside, more jars, more photos. A small journal newer than the others. And in it, one final note. "I heard footsteps last night. Not hers, not the girl's. His. Always him. Asking what makes a father keep looking. Asking what I forgot to hide. Rivera said they believe he recorded the tape as both confession and legacy. Not for redemption. Not even to be caught. Just to be remembered." "You stopped him." "John," she said. "You and Tomas, whatever you think, however much it cost you, ended this." I thanked her, though it didn't feel like anything was over. Later that day, when Sophie was asleep again, I stepped into the hallway and stared out the hospital window. Rain was coming in over the trees, slow and gray. I thought about that final line on the tape, "This one I won't bury." And I wondered how many others he had buried, how many hadn't been found, and whether somewhere someone else was still waiting for a knock that might never come. The trial never happened. 3 days before his indictment was finalized, Malcolm Hartman was found dead in his holding cell. The official report listed it as suicide bedsheet ceiling pipe, early morning hours when no one was watching. The guard on rotation claimed he'd checked in just 15 minutes prior, that everything had looked fine. But when they pulled the security footage, the timestamp froze. 2 hours of black screen followed by static. The text said it was a glitch. Rivera didn't believe it. Neither did I. His death didn't feel like closure. It felt like something unfinished, like the final act of control from a man who never let anyone else have the last word. The case files were sealed the following month, pending federal review. There were too many jurisdictions involved by then, too many cold cases reopened, too many gaps they were trying to fill with handwriting samples and dental records and genetic traces too degraded to read. I watched investigators come in from Georgia, Texas, Michigan. They brought boxes, theories, timelines, maps with pins, but no one could say how many there really were. Sophie stayed in the hospital for another week. She didn't say much. Wouldn't speak to the child psychologist, wouldn't answer the nurses unless I was in the room. But she let me brush her hair at night. She asked for warm socks. And once, just once, she asked if it was still raining. I told her no, that the storm had passed, and I think she knew what I meant. Hannah's remains were released 2 weeks later. There wasn't much to send home, but her brother Michael flew in to take her back to Colorado. He didn't speak at the private service, just stood with his hands folded, head down, while I read the eulogy. He thanked me afterward, said he didn't blame me, said he was grateful. But the way he looked at Sophie, I could see the questions. I couldn't answer them. I still can't. A week after that, I got the call from the sheriff's office in Gulf County. They'd identified one of the older resin-preserved objects from a missing persons case filed in 1994. A 6-year-old girl named Janie Palmer disappeared on a family camping trip. The father was blamed, though the case never went to trial. He died before charges were filed. Now, 31 years later, they wanted to notify the surviving sister. I gave them the names from the old journal. Contacts listed under a column labeled Second Witnesses. One of them matched Janie's aunt. I don't know if that helped. Maybe it just made things worse. 2 months passed. Sophie and I moved back inland, away from the water. I didn't take another case for a while. Just paperwork, evidence logs, helping Rivera with summaries when the feds needed documentation. I kept my badge, but I stopped wearing it. People in town didn't ask. The ones who knew didn't speak of it. The ones who didn't just assumed I'd taken leave. Tomas was the only one who said it out loud. He came by once in mid-June, brought a bag of groceries, and stood in the doorway with that look like he wasn't sure if he was still welcome. He was. We sat on the porch for a while, didn't talk much. He asked how Sophie was. I told him she'd started drawing again. Mostly trees, sometimes birds, never people. He nodded and said that was probably a good sign. Then, as he stood to leave, he pulled something from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. A key. "What's this?" I asked. "To the evidence locker," he said. "Bottom drawer far left. You might want to see it." I waited until the next day, drove to the station, signed myself in. The drawer held a single sealed envelope. Inside a note, handwritten, addressed to the father. I unfolded it slowly. The writing matched the journal entries. Clean, controlled, almost delicate. The letter said I chose her because she looked at the world without flinching. Because she didn't need to be told how to be still. Because in her silence I saw what I had spent my life trying to build. And for that I kept her. Not as a prisoner, as a legacy. I sat there for a long time just staring at those words. Legacy. Like he believed he'd created something worth passing down. Like Sophie was supposed to carry it. I shredded the note that same afternoon, logged the destruction, wrote my name at the bottom of the form, dated it, and never spoke of it again. Some things don't belong in evidence. Some things don't deserve to be preserved. A few weeks later, Sophie asked me what the stars were made of. I told her gases, light, heat science stuff. She frowned and said, "No, I mean, why are they so far away?" I didn't have an answer. I just sat with her and watched them come out one by one above the tree line. She leaned against my arm and whispered, "They can't reach us here." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. Some things you carry quietly. Not because they're small, but because they weigh too much to speak aloud. That's what these last 2 years have been for me. Not silence, exactly, just a different kind of sound. Softer, measured. Like learning how to live in a house where every room remembers something different. Sophie's 10 now. She's back in school part-time. Still doesn't say much to strangers, and I don't ask her to. She draws, though. Pages and pages. Not dark things, just still ones. Birds, pine trees, the ocean. She doesn't call them by name, but when I ask, she'll point and say, "That one stayed." I think she means the ones that didn't hurt her. Or maybe just the ones that didn't leave. We built a garden out back. Peppers, mostly. Tomatoes. She likes things she can measure with her hands. Soil that stays where it's put. Growth that comes slow and predictable. I've never been much of a gardener, but it's quiet work. Gives the day shape. Some mornings she hums while we water. It's the same tune every time. I haven't placed it yet, but I don't interrupt her to ask. I stayed on with the department, but I don't carry a badge anymore. I process evidence now, paper trails, digital archives, filing cold case data for the Bureau. It's the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mind just still enough. Some days I still catch myself glancing out the window at the trees, half expecting someone to step out. But nothing does. Not anymore. Rivera visits every couple of weeks. He retired 6 months back, moved down to Southern California with his sister. When he drives up, he brings Sophie books. Always adventure stories. Never mysteries. Says she'll find enough of those on her own. He's right. They never did close all the cases linked to Hartman. Too many gaps, too many years. But the victims they could identify got names again. Graves with markers. Families notified. I sat with some of them when the letters went out. A few cried. One woman just nodded and asked for a copy of the file. No ceremony, no closure speech. Just a stack of truth to take home. I think about Hannah every day. Not in the way people expect, not as a wound. More like a quiet echo. She was gentle, practical, quick to laugh, but slow to trust. She never liked deep water. I remember that now more than ever. She'd only go out with me when the weather was calm, and even then she wore her life vest the whole time. It makes no sense that she died on the sea. But that's the part I've had to learn to live with. Some goodbyes don't wait for answers. I tell Sophie stories about her mom sometimes. Nothing heavy, just little pieces. The way she used to hum when she graded papers. How she danced barefoot in the kitchen when the radio played something old. The first time she held Sophie at the hospital, she looked at me and whispered, "She already knows." I didn't ask what that meant. I think I understand now. If you've listened this far, thank you. These aren't stories we ever want to tell, but they matter. They name the forgotten. They give weight to what others tried to erase. And maybe if enough of us remember them, it keeps the dark from growing quiet again. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.